there's an auditorium, and they've got like the worst soundboard in the world and the worst lighting board in the world, but you push things and big stuff happens. And I got really into that and thought that was cool. I also wanted to be in a rock band, but I played French horn and then I played trumpet, so that didn't work out. And I started doing sound for bands at like Battle of the Bands in my high school, and lights, like I didn't care, which I did. And then through the son of a friend of my parents, who worked at a recording studio in New York, I got to go see my first recording studio, and I walked in there and saw a console with 5,000 knobs on it and thought, well, there you go. That's the ultimate turn something, something happens thing. And that was it, I was hooked. And started reading Mix Magazine from then on, and yeah, and that's it.
And I believe you went to university as a start of that quest?
I did, University of Miami. It was, well, sort of mid to late 80s, and at that point, going to university was a thing that, pretty much you just did, and my parents sort of insisted that I have a 4-year degree, which that's the equivalent of the 3-year degree here. And there were only 2 schools in the country that did recording. There was Berkeley in Boston and University of Miami. And Ken Pullman was the head of the program in Miami, and he was writing for Mix Magazine, and so that was my first choice. But it wasn't even a full-blown program. It was basically a major in music, and then a minor in electrical engineering, and then every single elective was a recording class. So as far as the music department was concerned, you were just a really bad music major. The electrical engineering department didn't even talk to us. And then all the rest of your time was spent either in a class about recording or trying to get time in either the little 4-track reel-to-reel studio or the 24-track studio and make a mess.
Was it a worthwhile experience? Did you learn? Did it prepare you, do you think?
Yeah, for me, absolutely. I learned on actually an MCI console, just like what's in the Gus Dudgeon suite, though mine was a nice yellow as opposed to the brown, slightly different model. But
I think he requested that colour. Did he? Is that right?
No,
oh, it's
he
not
wanted it purple.
Oh, right.
All right.
He wanted that muddy brown. He was most pissed off about it.
Well, Florida manufacturing, what are you going to do? But it was very broken, and so I immediately, that was the studio, and it was 2-inch 24-track tape, and then that console, and you immediately learned how to work around problems. So all my troubleshooting skills and my sort of need to understand how things work, because they're constantly broken, so you have to figure out which part of them is working, which part isn't, so you can use the parts that are, and all of that came out of school. Plus, the just textbook knowledge, really knowing what all the different kinds of microphones are, how a compressor works. And then for me, I happened to be there at a great time with a lot of other people that I'm still in touch with, and a lot of people in the industry who are still doing things like Joe Barresi and Neil Avron. I was in classes with those guys 25, 30 years ago. So yeah, every aspect of it for me was absolutely worthwhile.
And from there on, how did you think you'd approach getting actually into the industry and getting paid?
Well, at that point, you went, as you call it here, the T-boy route, where you basically show up and work for free, and they tell you how lucky you are to be working for free. And back then, it was exactly the same thing. Like Joe Barresi, if you look at his early time, he's cleaning toilets at Sound City. But I was offered a job with a manufacturer, New England Digital, who made the synclavier. It's one of the early digital sequencer, then sampler things, then disc recording, one of the very first sort of digital music things to exist. And they offered me a job, and it was way more money than none. And I took the job. But the job was to be the field service engineer. So basically, people would spend a lot of money on these things. So it's already pretty cool artists for the most part, or at least rich artists who had them. Then they'd be in a session and they'd break, and they would make a phone call, and I would have to hop in a van and go to the studio and fix it while everybody is standing around watching. So when you show up, you're the worst person in the world. Then you get it working, you're the best person in the world, but they also don't trust you, so they make you stay around. So it's like, yeah, you better go sit on the couch and watch Sting work. Like, okay, I'll do that. So I got to hang around in a lot of sessions that I would never have been in, but because of that. So I did that for a couple of years, both in LA and then also in London, which is where I met my lovely wife. And then just realized, well, I wasn't making records, so I quit that after 3 years, I think, and went freelance, which was absolutely terrifying. But at that point, I was a synclavier programmer, and then a synth programmer, and then I was a very early Pro Tools guy. So this whole geek thing kind of gave me a leg up. So I had a skill that would get me in on sessions that, as an engineer, there's no way, because I hadn't done anything at all. But then I'd be in on the session and learn, because this is back in the day when people had money, so there'd be more than one person making a record, which is not the case anymore.
So I understand you spent some time with Michael Jackson and doing on that sort of gig.
Yeah, because
was it Quincy Jones and Bruce Dean as
well? No, because of the synclavier stuff, I did a tour with Michael Jackson where actually we played Cardiff, and Debbie and I were saying that's the last time we were in Cardiff. So that was in '92, something like that, because I'm old. But so I did the tour, and then when they started up the next record, which was the History record, they said, well, he was gonna work in LA, but then there was the earthquake, the Northridge earthquake in January of '94. So he told the 2 studios that he booked out for a year, see you later, and went to New York. And they said, well, could you come to New York for 3 days to set up the synclavier? And I was there for a year and a half. So that was post Quincy Jones, but it was Bruce Dean, and I mean a cast of thousands for 18 months, both in New York and then back in LA.
So as a long gig for a start.
A very long gig. Yeah, it's a good, basically the first record I was really employed to work on. Yeah, that was all right.
And what did you do with the money?
I bought a house. Yeah.
Is that good career advice?
Yes. Well, it used to be, right? Real estate, that's it. That's the thing. So yeah, I mean, but literally it basically bankrolled me being able to continue to be freelance and suck at what I did and not work, and but I had that one big project which helped.
And so I thought you had invested in a small amount of gear and then used that house as a small base for your own productions and learning?
Yeah, I mean, at first I've now had a studio, whatever that means. I mean, a room with some stuff in it that includes a pair of speakers. So I guess that's what makes a studio at this point. For 27, 28 years or something like that. So from the Michael Jackson record, I had a bunch of synths, and I had a couple of little mixers, and then I got a couple of DA88s, which were videotape-based 8-track things like ADATs, if you've heard of those, whatever.
Before hit hard disk.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Before, like Pro Tools existed as a stereo thing, and it was called Sound Tools. There was no Pro Tools yet, but that was sort of the first thing. So I immediately wanted to be able to work on stuff, but I couldn't expect my friends to afford to book a studio. So I was very early in the kind of owning the means of production mindset of, if I can do something, I want to be able to do it with the stuff that I've got. And that, of course, exploded into all the other stuff that I've got. But yeah, that's always been my mindset, is I want to be able to control as much as possible about what I can and can't do. So I don't say no because of some external thing.
Do you have gear list? Did that?
You know what? I did. I really did until about a year ago.
Because you only got a few bits of outboard in that wall that you have.
There's a couple things. Yeah. Yeah.
If you Google the wall of gear and wall.
No, I don't know. Well, basically now all of my gear is in a studio in Monmouth. Rockfield, just outside Monmouth, called Mono Valley. And having all of the gear installed there, and this is my mix rig. This is not something I bring to do talks. I took this off the desk where I mix and brought it with me. So this is my gear list now, that's it. Like, I bought the new MacBook Pro. And it's, marginally better than the old MacBook Pro, but like, that's my gear list, and not having the gear in my house is what made me finally stop buying gear constantly. But there was the gear list that started off with, I want the cool new thing, and then it became, you want the cool old thing, and then for a while it became these amazing studios are closing, their gear is just going to go to a broker and it's going to leave the country. I'm going to buy everything that I can afford at the time. And I walked out of Motown when they closed, walked out of Sound City when they closed with like a stack of gear and as much money as I could borrow at the time. And then I always had enough gear for a recording studio, even though I just had a mix room. And I kind of knew that eventually something would happen, and then Mono Valley is what happened.
I was going to ask later about the move to Wales. But
well, we'll come back to that.
Well, I mean, I was just thinking, you're using this very nice Neve as a stand for your
Yeah.
for your MacBook.
Well, so my mixing progression was I started off, I mean, a few mixes where people would book a studio and I go mix on an SSL or something like that. But I was not at the level as a mixer where people would spend a bunch of money. So I needed to be able to mix at home, and this is why I had to own the means of production, whatever. So I had a Mackie analog, like 3 16 input mixers all going into each other. Then I had one of those 32 input 8 bus analog mixers, then a digital, just all of the sort of home studio stuff that you would have. And then I kind of went into the box because the Mackie was not recallable, the analog one, and it was starting to be a pain. So I mixed records. We actually listened to one in the car not that long ago in the box, 12 years ago, something like that, 100%
HD rig?
There's no HD, that didn't exist. It was a mixed rig, right. Yeah. And it sounded great. Like, wow, I have not learned a thing since then. But then, you'd always, when there was money, you would go mix on a console. That's just what you did, because mixing in the computer, that was for people who couldn't mix on consoles. It wasn't a viable alternative in people's minds. And then for Stadium Arcadium, the Chili Peppers record, they wanted to mix it on an old Neve. And there were 2 people mixing because there were 38 songs, and there was no way one person, it would have taken half a year with the rate that everything happens during that project. So I was one of 2 people, and the other guy had already booked the really good old Neve mixing room. And I booked another room in town, and it sucked, and then I booked another room in town, and it sucked. And I thought, well, I've got a room with a ton of gear at that point. I had outboard gear and stuff. And it just doesn't have the Neve, and I actually found one to rent for that record, half of which I now own. That's half of the big Neve that's at Mono Valley. But then we had that and 2 Studer tape machines in the studio for 3 months, 4 months. I keep looking over at my wife because I get stuff wrong. And we just loved them because they're like the best pieces of furniture ever, and they're space heaters. And they happen to sound really good, but they're just awesome looking and feeling. It's like great old anything. And when they left, and I just had my Pro Control back, it's stupid, but that was the super gearless moment. And I actually spent a little over a year, finding a console that I could afford, and then that spilled over into 2, and eventually whatever. But that's the evolution of all my gear.
That's interesting. So you mentioned Studers. Do you miss tape?
No.
Shall I ask another question?
No, look, we can talk about it. It comes out as sort of a line now because I've said it a few times. The people who are nostalgic for tape never use tape. Tape is a total pain in the ass. It doesn't sound like what goes into it, and everybody says, yeah, but it's better. Like, no, it's different. Sometimes it's better, but if you don't know what you're doing with a tape machine, I would say 90% of the time it's worse. Just to a tiny little anecdote to back this up. So while analog tape was still a thing, 3348s, which were the Sony digital tape machines, had just come out. The 3324, the 24-track version of those had been out for a little while. So digital tape was starting to be a thing. I don't remember what year this was, but maybe 1990, something like that. So analog tape was still king. I got a call. I was working in a studio. Somebody called really late. Like, there's nobody in the building except Andrew, this young kid. Put it through to Andrew. And it was an engineer, really great engineer, who was working in Nashville. And he just put up a fresh reel of tape and hit play. And it was really quiet. And then he went back and put a bunch of tracks in record. And hit record. And all of a sudden, it's really noisy. And he forgotten that, I'm not going to bother explaining any of this, but when you bias the tape, which is what you have to do to record on it, it just gets really noisy. And when you have 24 really noisy things together, that's a lot of noise. And he was freaking out. He thought, my tape machine's broken, the studio's broken. So I found a piece of tape that hadn't been recorded on, put it up, did the exact same thing. No, that's right, tape sucks, don't worry about it. And so that was the mindset. You were constantly trying to overcome tape. You were trying to either plan for it, because you'd spend an hour, if you were quick, getting drum sounds, just listening to the microphones through the desk with the tape machine and input. And then you'd go for your first take and hit record. And when you hit rewind and play again, you hope to God that it didn't sound terrible. That's the thought behind tape then. So digital tape was magic. It sounded so much more like what went in. So what I miss is the workflow stuff, not I'll do 50 solos and then you sort it out. It's do you want this to be the solo, or do you want us to blow it away forever and you'll try and do better?